White people have never even liked each other. And why would they? They're awful. White people love to act like they've built the most advanced, unified civilizations, but history suggests they've spent more time fighting, betraying, and resenting one another than actually working together. They waged wars of brutal conquest against their own neighbors. They divided themselves into endless class hierarchies where even the rich barely tolerated each other. Their royal families intermarried so much they caused genetic disasters rather than share power with outsiders. They built entire nations on the idea that some white people weren't white enough. Even today, their political and social divisions are so extreme that they can barely function as societies. At some point, we have to ask, if white people were truly the standard for human civilization, why have they spent history being their own worst enemy? White people spent most of their history slaughtering each other. The 100 Years' War, white people fighting white people for 116 years. The War of Roses, white nobles slaughtering each other for a throne. The English Civil War, white people fighting over how they should govern themselves. The Napoleonic Wars, France versus the rest of white Europe for nearly 2 decades. World War I and II, white people causing global destruction over their own internal disputes. Meanwhile, non-white societies built systems of cooperation. Many indigenous societies maintained peace through complex alliances and trade networks. African kingdoms built economic coalitions instead of destroying each other over minor grievances. Asian dynasties formed diplomatic marriages and power-sharing agreements to avoid unnecessary war. White people weren't building civilizations. They were just taking breaks between wars. White people's social hierarchies have always been built on hating each other. Medieval Europe was structured so that peasants suffered while nobles hoarded wealth, and they still fought amongst themselves. The Catholic and Protestant schism turned Christianity into an excuse for white people to unalive each other for centuries. Aristocrats in every European country looked down on merchants, who looked down on laborers, who looked down on beggars. Pure misery from top to bottom. Even within the same country, they developed regional and class-based divisions that kept them in constant conflict. They created strict racial hierarchies that excluded certain white groups, such as Irish, Italians, and Slavs, until it became politically convenient to include them. Meanwhile, other cultures built more flexible social systems. Indigenous societies often had communal governance rather than rigid feudalism. African and Middle Eastern cultures allowed for social mobility through trade, skill, and leadership. Asian dynasties promoted scholars and civil servants over bloodline alone. White people weren't uniting society. They were dividing themselves into misery. White people's royal families were too busy betraying each other to maintain stability. European monarchies relied on fragile marriage alliances that constantly collapsed into war. They intermarried so much they gave themselves hemophilia and other genetic disorders. Kings and queens were regularly assassinated, overthrown, and executed by their own relatives. The French, English, and Russian monarchies were all wiped out by their own people out of sheer hatred. Even today, European royal families barely tolerate each other, holding centuries-old grudges. Meanwhile, non-white monarchies maintain stability longer. China's dynastic system lasted for thousands of years, adapting to maintain power. The Ottoman Empire incorporated different ethnic groups rather than just inbreeding its rulers. African kingdoms often had check on royal power through councils and elders. White people weren't ruling effectively. They were playing a generational game of betrayal. White people have never even agreed on who counts as white. The British didn't consider the Irish fully white for centuries. The US didn't consider Italians or Eastern Europeans white until the mid-20th century. The Nazis reclassified entire groups of white people as subhuman when it fit their political agenda. Even today, white people argue over who is truly white based on ancestry, culture, and arbitrary rules. Meanwhile, other cultures didn't waste time on this nonsense. Most non-white societies recognize cultural identity over arbitrary racial purity. Many indigenous groups welcomed outsiders into their communities through marriage or adoption. African, Asian, and Middle Eastern civilizations absorbed new groups rather than excluding them. White people weren't defining race. They were constantly moving the goalposts. Even in the modern day, white people can't get along with each other. Europeans still hold centuries-old grudges against neighboring countries. Americans are politically divided to the point of complete dysfunction. White nationalist groups argue over who is pure enough to join them. Conservatives and liberals within white societies hate each other more than they hate their supposed common enemies. They spend more time fighting over regional accents and cultural differences than actually resolving their problems. Meanwhile, other cultures focus on collective survival. Indigenous communities emphasize cooperation over ideological purity. Non-white resistance movements prioritize shared struggles over minor differences. Black, Latino, and Asian political groups often unify around common causes despite cultural diversity. White people weren't creating stable societies. They were just keeping their infighting interesting. If white people were truly the most advanced societies, why have they spent history at war with themselves? Cope.